UFOs, monsters, mysteries. You're listening to Talking Weird. And now, from a cabin deep in the Northwoods, your hosts, Dr. Dean Bertram and Jenn Durrell.
Well, hey, baby.
Hey, baby. How are you?
Good. It's a hot night in the North Woods tonight, though. So if the audience sees me starting to sweat up in the loft of my cabin, you'll have to bear with me. It's cooking tonight.
Yeah, it's really hot here in Missouri, too. So
I bet.
But,
how was work today? I think you have a little story from the haunted location, which we'll get to quickly before we bring in our guest.
You can't say it's haunted.
Okay, it's the historic location that may or may not be haunted.
Okay. Well, I mean, there's a little one. So when I show up to work, we normally go in and we open up the location. And when I got there, my boss was already in there. So I had asked where he was at, if he was in there, and he said he was. So anyways, as I go in the door, he's kind of talking to himself. And anyways, as I go in there a little further, and he's just like, "Were you just downstairs?" And I said, "No, I wasn't. I just walked in the door." And so then he gets really frustrated and starts yelling at the house, just kind of stating, you need to not do that because of, if you keep doing that, no one's gonna be here to take care of the house, blah blah blah. And so he's a little freaked out and a little frustrated with it. But so after he got done with that, I asked him, what did you hear anything? And he said, yeah, I heard chitter chattering. And he responded to it, and then he heard it again. So he thought it was actually me, and it sounded like me. So I was just kind of curious whether or not it was something residual or just some type of that, like the house has already recorded my voice, that type of thing. And so that's something that's ongoing kind of investigation that I'm trying to do by documenting whenever we have those odd experiences. And so I don't know. It's kind of neat.
Maybe we'll have to chat with our guest a little bit about that tonight. I'm sure he'd be interested.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
I'll be honest. I fanboy out maybe once a year over having a guest on, and this is one of those fanboy nights. He's the author of the iconic book Angels and Aliens, UFOs and the Mythic Imagination. And this is a beat up old ex-library copy. I had a new copy when I lived in Sydney, but when I rebought it, it's actually out of print. You should get it though. Anybody watching who hasn't read this book should just track down a used copy. It's such a wonderful book. It was one of the books which, when I was preparing to do my PhD dissertation on UFO belief, really solidified the idea that I was able to approach the UFO phenomenon seriously, but didn't have to go down a total extraterrestrial hypothesis, hardcore belief kind of route, that there was important aspects to this. Anyway, I really can't think of a better guest to have on the show to ring in the 75th anniversary of the original Flying Saucer Report than tonight's guest. Indeed, he's one of the greatest thinkers, I think, to ever ponder the UFO mystery. In his upcoming book, Cosmos Calling, which I absolutely can't wait to read, he chronicles his pursuit of the UFO mystery for several decades, highlighting his encounters with important cultural figures in search of insights about the phenomenon. New York Times reporter Ralph Blumenthal credits tonight's guest with introducing the late Harvard psychiatrist John Mack to accounts of alien abduction of humans, specifically the parallels between such reports and traditional rites of transition or initiation. His articles have appeared in the New York Times, Esquire, the San Francisco Chronicle, and in numerous book anthologies. He's been interviewed by a plethora of TV and radio hosts, including Larry King, George Norrie, Michael Regan, Bill O'Reilly, and the late, great Rush Limbaugh. As a periodic talk radio and TV talk show host himself, he's interviewed a wide plethora of just incredible guests, including the novelist Anne Rice, political activist David Horowitz, US Senator John Glenn, who was the first man, of course, to orbit the Earth, comedian Phyllis Diller, NBC Newsman Hugh Downs, and comedian Dick Gregory. And I can't reiterate how long I've actually wanted to talk to this guest in person. So again, I'm delighted to welcome to the show one of the greatest thinkers to ever ponder the UFO mystery, Keith Thompson. Greetings, Keith.
Hey, Dean and Jenn. Good to see you both. Great to be here. And that introduction, I'm kind of like, Who dat? New phone.
Oh, I could have gone on much
What does
longer.
that
I had to
mean?
rein it.
Yeah.
I had to rein it in. I could have gone on for the show. Could have been just your introduction.
Well, it's. I guess it ain't bragging if you really done it. That is really my story. Big parts of my story, but we'll find out whatever else is part of my story tonight too. It's great to be here. I appreciate
Yes.
the invitation and
Yeah.
look forward to talking.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah. So let's kind of start off with what got you into UFOs?
Well, I'm not one of those people who had a UFO experience. I've had experiences with non-ordinary realities, different kinds. I had a decisive experience in my 20s. Before, I'll just touch on this because it took me some time to realize it's in some way related to the same domain as UFOs. I was in my 20s. I was body surfing off the coast of Hawaii, and long story short, the waves got the best of me. And before I had ever heard, I'm old enough to say before I'd ever heard of the near-death experience, the stages of them and so forth, I drowned, effectively. I died. I experienced dying. I knew I was going to die, faced it existentially, left my body, saw my friends on the shore, which is not supposed to be something you're able to do. By the way, I saw my body in the ocean. So right there was a kind of a giveaway that the game board of this place called reality didn't quite work the way I thought. I thought awareness was created by the body. Not that I thought over much about, well, is the brain the source of consciousness? You don't think about that stuff in your 20s. But I assume that when you're alive, the lights are on, and when you're dead, they're off. And I was dead, and the lights were still on. And I heard my friend on the shore, Mary, saying, and I say, heard her. So I'm the body that I'm not is 200 yards probably out in the ocean. I mean, really heavy waves, crazy stuff. And I heard my friend Mary, as if I was as close to her as I am to you both on the internet here. She said, I told him not to go in. I told him it was too rough. And I went to Mary, if you will, and I said, I'm fine. Actually, I've never been better, because there was a sense of bliss, peace, home. Anyway, she couldn't hear me. And the significance of this was that the next day, when I survived, went back into my body after going through the tunnel and all the stages. Again, I didn't know about any of this. Raymond Moody had written his book, Life After Life, but I was too busy having life after life in this life, in your 20s. I wasn't thinking about nearly dying. I was thinking about trying to really live. And so the next day I said, after I survived, I was over the trauma, at least the immediate trauma, which, by the way, it is it's really hard on the body to nearly die. I don't recommend that. There are ways to have the experience of a near-death experience without actually tempting the death of the body. The next day I said, Mary, I'd like to chat with you. She said, okay, let's take a walk. And she said, what's up? And I said, yesterday when you were at the beach. And she said, yeah. I said, I heard exactly what you said. Why didn't he listen to me? Why did he go out there? I can only tell you the look in her face. It's just all the color left in her face. And she knew what it meant, and I knew what it meant. But again, neither of us had heard of near-death experiences. And so I was telling everybody that I had died and come back. And they were all telling me, well, you'll get over the trauma. You really need to get some therapy. By the way, one reason I think I'm telling this story, and one reason I think I have an empathy with the UFO witnesses, because it's the same deal. You didn't experience that. You couldn't have experienced that. Aliens don't abduct people. Thank you. Go away. So I'm very much open to the UFO experiences, but I don't have them explained. Okay, I don't know what all the levels that are going on. So anyway, it took me a long time. Thanks to Oprah Winfrey for popularizing the near-death experience. Eventually, within a few years, I go, oh my God, I had one of those. Because again, well, I'd already done a little bit of research, and then I met the great Dr. Ken Ring, who wrote a lot of good books on the near-death experience. But it's part of the why in Angels and Aliens I was drawing comparisons between the UFO experience and the near-death experience. So that's a long story. That's my anomaly, a major life anomaly story, which has been profoundly important because when I came back into the body, that sense that awareness is everything, that there's nothing that is not conscious. Consciousness is everything. And how do we get the material world is a more interesting question. In the materialist side, it's how do we get consciousness? How do we get the subjective experience? How does consciousness arise out of matter? It doesn't. Consciousness is the immediate given of empirical given of being. We wake up every morning to the knowledge of whether or not we do it. I am. I'm aware. I'm conscious. I'm alive. So consciousness is prior to everything. How do we get the material world? Now that's interesting. So how did I get into UFOs? I was an elementary school student, is how. I had a classroom, great teacher, Mrs. Lowry, and we had current events times. We would take turns giving current event reports. So it was my turn to give a current event report. Well, the famous Hillsdale, Michigan case of UFOs was going on. 3 or 4 days of lights and strange anomalous objects, classic UFO case. The late, great CBS anchor Walter Cronkite led the news like 3 nights in a row. Another day of UFOs in Michigan. We now go to Bob Schieffer for that report. It was a national story. And I loved it because I love the news. I was very precocious about politics and ideas. So I covered the Michigan UFO case in my class. I brought clippings and I told how it had happened. Well, the significance of that case, you probably know, was that an Air Force consultant named J. Allen Heineck, whose job it was, he didn't know this right at first. His job was to play cleanup man for the Air Force. He didn't know this. He thought his job was really to be an authentic, high integrity investigator. But the Air Force wanted him to come in and explain it all away, to be a debunker. But they never really told him that because he was a man of integrity. He finally read between the lines. So he went into Michigan, talked to people, interviewed witnesses. There was one side aspect of the Michigan case. Some of the sightings were near a marsh. There is, as you know, a phenomenon called marsh gas, swamp gas, with the rotting vegetation leads to chemical reactions, and there can be luminous, sort of like bioluminescent stuff. Nothing like full-blown apparitions of aircraft, I assure you. But he did his best to try to address the witnesses, and he let slip that at least in maybe one side corridor of the Michigan cases, it could be connected to swamp gas. When he used that phrase, he's later described, he said he was absolutely in dread, watching reporters jump out of their seats, go to what, in those days, not cell phones, but to pay phones, put in the dimes to call the Bureau and say, Alan Heineck says it's all swamp gas. Well, this led to a national uproar, especially in Michigan, because the people in Michigan said, we may be rural folks, but we're not total rubes. We don't know what it is we saw, but it weren't swamp gas. I remember thinking, wow, this is an amazing thing. I would have expected, because I'm a good young American idealistic, that the Air Force would come in and sort of tell us what's really going on. Well, good luck with that. The government, by the way, my own view on most of the so-called cover-up, I'm going to make a big segue here and I'll make a big generalization, and I'll be more precise if we want to talk about this side. But I think the main thing that's being withheld from us by the military and government is they don't have any idea what to make of this phenomenon. When you look at what happens in the Nimitz, USS Nimitz, these rapid trajectories, enormous speed, in less than 1 second, traveling 60 miles, then the things effectively dematerialize. pretty amazing. So I don't expect the Air Force to hold a news conference to say there's something in our skies, comes and goes with impunity, has a vast technological advantage. We don't know what it is, but we'll keep you posted. Probably not. Probably not. So I told the story in the class. And you know what? Here's the funny thing. Even then, I told everybody in class this was what the debate was about, how this guy named Alan Heineck for the Air Force came in and seemingly explained it all away as swamp gas. That was actually not a fair characterization. But he was at the end of his rope with the Air Force. He saw what happened to him as a result of being associated with that pseudo explanation. He said, I'm done pulling the chestnuts out of the fire for these people. And he basically quit. Mm-hmm. But I remember in my class when it was time to take questions from my fellow students, which is how we did it, said, well, Keith, if you don't think, so you think it was aliens, right? If it wasn't swamp gas, it was aliens. And I remember kind of young and curious, I said, well, that doesn't follow. But I said, no, I'm not saying that's what it is. I'm saying swamp gas is probably not what it is. So here's what's fun. I had a great teacher, Gloria Lowry. I'm sure she's no longer on the planet. Never got a chance to tell her. What she did at that point was interrupt and say, what I think Keith is saying, and I go, okay, I'll listen to this. What I think Keith is saying is it's important to keep an open mind. Follow the evidence wherever it leads. Yeah. It could be extraterrestrial, right, Keith? I said, it maybe could be. She said, it doesn't look like the evidence suits the swamp gas thing. I said, no, it doesn't. I thought this is like not, at one level I thought she's rescuing me, but no, she's actually saw me. That sense of being seen, it was one of the first times as a young person, I've just been blessed. I've just had a benediction. I've just been affirmed for having an open mind, and it never left me. And she also, here's the other thing she said. Then she said, well, thank you, Mr. Thompson. Teachers will sometimes call you by your last name to sum it all. She goes, you have the makings of a good reporter or maybe a scientist, or who knows, maybe a detective, but follow the evidence wherever it leads. So I gathered up my clippings and I sat down and I still remembered as clearly as I'm describing it. And that really does epitomize my approach to the UFO all these years. Follow the evidence wherever it goes. Hold back on I didn't realize I was an empiricist. I was taking an empirical approach. I didn't know that word yet. I hadn't gone to college and heard of William James, the great American philosopher who celebrated what he called radical empiricism. No matter how strange the experience, you allow the observation to be registered. The debunker, pretending to be a skeptic in all of these debates, UFOs, paranormal stuff, the pseudo-skeptic says, well, it didn't happen, it couldn't happen. We know from the laws of science these things can happen, so we can take it off the table. That's not skepticism. That's the same thing that the Vatican told Galileo. He says, look through my telescope. I'll tell you, the Earth orbits the sun. They said, no, it doesn't. No, we won't. Look through your telescope one more time, and it's house arrest. He kept at it, spent the rest of his life in house arrest. The current debunkers are like the Vatican, except they're doing it in the name of science. So anyway, I've been affirmed all along by being an empiricist, by following the evidence, entertaining theories, entertaining hypotheses. And I happen to believe the UFO thing, we're not going to get out of this thing with just aliens. We're going to have aliens plus anomalies. Our worldview is not going to hold because what we know from the paranormal dimensions of the UFO alone, even if it is extraterrestrial, some of them, they can't do what they do if reality that we think that's normally here is doing what we think it does. Materialist, physicalist worldview doesn't hold up. So that's my big opening blast. Take it where you will.
I think it's very true that, to me, the value of all of these things is exactly what you said, that it knocks on the door of reality, that it's the fact that it's ignored by science, but particularly the paradigms that science operates in, it's very easy for people to want to be accepted by science and to want to try to get the physical evidence because it's what they're trained is the way reality works. But science doesn't work like that. Science, as Thomas Kuhn said, is this organization built on paradigms. And if anything doesn't fit the paradigm, it gets ignored. But I think so much of Fortean researchers and UFO researchers want so badly in science, all they try to do is present something scientific rather than looking at some of the lyrical truths like you did in Angels and Aliens. And I think that to me is often the best road that we can really travel rather than trying to beat down the walls of science. So is that something you've kind of consciously done when you've been writing things like Angels and Airwaves? It seems to me that you looked at the broader imaginal and the broader mythical structures of this rather than going, well, I've got to prove it, whether you want to prove it as nuts and bolts or interdimensional or swamp gas or whatever. You didn't ever seem to have that crazy requirement to prove the what this reality really was or wasn't.
I've come to think there's two feelings about the place of science in this. I think true science, genuine science, empiricism, inquiry, what Richard Feynman, one of his last books, the great Richard Feynman said, for me, it's the kick of discovery, the kick of discovering something. Charles Darwin, I sometimes compare my approach to UFOs to Darwin. I'm going to make it very clear. I don't compare myself to Charles Darwin, but he wasn't even really a scientist per se. He was a British gentleman who had the leisure, or the leisure, as we'd say, to walk off into the woods and to the beaches and to go to the Galapagos and pick up fossils and say the fossils on this island compared to the fossils on that island. He was a naturalist, and he scientifically approached the greatest discovery of the 19th century, namely the evolutionary worldview, which, by the way, challenged the predominant paradigm of religious science. And there's been an attempt to sort of, the scientists get matter and the religious types get the inner life, which is not really working out well either, because the scientists doing matter are finding the quantum realm, which behaves really spooky ways. So even matter doesn't turn out to be matter.
Yeah.
So I don't think ordinary what Thomas Kuhn called normal science is going to. I understand why most scientists stay away from this. There's no funding. It's a career stopper. It's a very brave. And by the way, the only scientists are social scientists. Some of the best people in the field, if you will, are Professor Jeffrey Kripal of Rice University. He's a religion scholar. The best scholars on this are the religious scholars, because I think it is fundamentally it's a religious issue. Now, when I say that, I don't believe we should hand it over to conventional religion either. I don't mean religions. It is deeply a religious issue. It's about the nature of reality, the nature of creation. These are phenomena that transgress the line between matter and mind, and on so many levels they go to. And you ask, how did I come into to look at the mythological? Well, what did Ezekiel see? What was the burning bush? And by the way, I'm not saying that the Bible is filled with UFO stories. No, it's very reductionistic. The Bible is filled with miracles that have echoes to what we would call the UFO phenomenon. I basically look at the UFO phenomenon that we associate with 1947 onward. I call it the UFO frame of reference for a larger phenomenon that has other frames of reference. The fairy faith of the Celtic cultures, the shamanic tradition, that's another frame of reference. The near-death experience, a lot of luminosity in the near-death experience, bright, brilliant light and wisdom figures. Well, there's a lot of bright, brilliant light in UFOs and wisdom figures. Not all of them. Wisdom figures, the little grays who abduct people, are not very friendly. But even they, I think, can be found, their precursors can be found in the legends of the daimons, which was, as you know, what was the phrase that was used before Christianity demonized the daimons, the intermediate middle realms of phenomena that we find in mythology. Christianity said we can keep that realm, but we have to demonize the bad ones and angelicize the good ones. So out of that daimonic realm, we get the angels being the good ones who do what the church says. The demons go to Satan. So it's not a religious phenomenon in that sense. I don't want to give this over to religion, but it's deeply a religious phenomenon, and it also pertains to science. So it straddles religion and science. It's a core mystery, and that's what got me coming back. I didn't expect to be doing a second book. I kind of retired from the UFO phenomenon. I used to say to people, I feel lucky that I escaped from the phenomenon unscathed, because there's a larger conversation to be had. I don't want to name any names, but people often don't do well with the UFO phenomenon. Partly because of the abductions. If you're known as an abductee, well, I'll be honest. Whitley Strieber, who's a friend of mine, and not a close friend or anything, but I mean we're on good terms, and I like his witness to this phenomenon. He showed a great deal of openness and creativity and willingness to put aside answers and stick with the core that he has described, as a career move. If he was trying to, sure, he did well with his book Communion, but I can tell you, having a UFO abduction is really not a good, smart career move. So the price that people pay to be associated. So in any case, I feel I escaped from the phenomenon, if you will, after Angels and Aliens, took a lot of time off and went on to write about other things. Now I'm coming back. I don't quite know why, except that somehow I feel my daimon, my guidance is saying, you did a lot of legwork. You did a lot of work. So this time around, Mr. Thompson, it looks like UFOs are going to be your thing. There's another book.
Just hope your diamond's kinder. Hopefully your diamond's kinder to you than Socrates. Hopefully it doesn't lead you to a terrible end. But listen, another book from you, to be honest, was long overdue. When your book came out, I got it, I think the very early 90s. It came out about 1990, is that right? With the public
1991, I think. Yeah, 1991.
I read it shortly thereafter, and it was, like I said, for me, it was game changing. I was already interested in all of this, obviously, but it was one of those books, along with books by Vallée and some books by John Keel, that made me really go, hey, I can look at this. I can look at this academically and take this seriously and look at it as for the cultural and social and religious, as you were saying, significance that this material actually is presenting. But I don't have to then be an ETH believer. I don't have to instantly attach myself to a specific belief, which is the culturally stock standard belief most people seem to have, or at least then particularly, who were interested in UFOs. But on that note, the way that ETH, we were talking a little bit in before the show started about how that developed and how that idea of nuts and bolts sources became the preeminent kind of idea. Let's go back to 1947. Let's go back to that very original reporting on June 24 by Ken Arnold, and tell us a little bit about that and how that might have been taken the wrong way and went off in a different direction to what Ken initially actually saw.
Well, that's going to be, as I wrote about in Angels and Aliens, I defined the Ken Arnold experience of June 24, 1947 as ufology, and that's the term, of course, the field is sometimes called ufology. The modern UFO phenomenon, the creation myth was the Ken Arnold sighting. It wasn't the first sighting of anomalous stuff, it turns out, factually, historically, but mythologically it was. It was the origin myth of this modern UFO phenomenon. So here's the deal. A private pilot from Boise, Idaho, in his 30s, was out on a business trip, and he took a detour near Mount Rainier because there was a U.S. Marine convoy plane that had gone down. Everybody knew it had crashed, but no one knew where the remains were. And there was a $5,000 reward, which was not a pocket change in 1947. So he was hoping to catch a glimpse of some metal. Well, he caught a glimpse of something that day. His cockpit lit up with light. He saw 9. Now this is the key. What he reported seeing eventually when he landed and asked people, anybody else been reporting this? He saw 9 objects in formation that were skipping like saucers over water. As you could, if you could imagine saucers skipping over water, they were skipping like saucers. That immediately became, Arnold says they were shaped like saucers. He saw flying saucers. Well, it's a small point, but he never said he saw saucers. He never said they were shaped like saucers. In fact, he said the shape, there were two stages of his description. He said they were shaped like stingrays, okay? Even then, it was pretty wild stuff. So here's what I'm going to be opening my new book. It's called Cosmos Calling, and I'll say more about what I mean by that title. I'm going to be opening the book with a chapter on Ken Arnold, revisiting the creation myth, because long after Ken Arnold had passed away, his daughter, Kim Arnold, came forward in an interview publicly and said, you know, I'm going to clear the record. I have become, in effect, the archivist for my father's papers, and I'm ready to say what he was not willing to say. There was an esoteric dimension, a hidden dimension. Let me use my notes here. She said in an interview she gave, Kim Arnold disclosed that her father was, quote, perplexed and confused about everybody's concepts of aliens visiting from other planets, that type of thing. My father said these objects pulsated with blue-white light from the center of their surfaces, similar to the rhythm and beating of our own human hearts. Now that's a very different issue, a different image. He was smart enough not to tell that kind of imagery, because it was strange enough that he was alleged to have said he saw flying saucers. He said he saw objects flying like saucers. Even then, he was considered kind of kooky. He said they pulsated with blue and white light from the center of their surfaces, according to his daughter, similar to the beating of our own human hearts. My father believed they were alive. Absolutely. They were capable of changing their density. Rather than anything made out of nuts and bolts, he felt they were not mechanical in any sense at all. If he had disclosed that, he would have been even more cannon fodder for the comedians of the time. He might also have been asked to take a psychiatric exam in order to keep his pilot's license. Yeah. But so here's one more piece. She says, no less remarkably, Kim Arnold says her dad believed UFOs come from a larger dimensional world, quote, the world where we go when we die. Now, again, that was a transmission. That's a revelation of some sort. We assume that the modern legend is Ken Arnold saw something extraterrestrial. He saw something eschatological. Eschatology is the division of religion, as you know, that deals with the final things, the end of time, the end of a life. Eschatology, where things are going. The book of Revelation is eschatology. Pretty wild stuff in the book of Revelations. Hope it doesn't come true in a literal sense. Hope it's figurative. Hope it's figurative. In any case, we didn't. So the UFO creation myth came to be identified with content that wasn't what Ken Arnold said. And yet, it actually speaks beautifully to the thesis that I developed in Angels and Aliens, is that there's an inherent doubleness in this phenomenon. You can always get at least two interpretations out of anything. So the extraterrestrial hypothesis, of course, is probably the mainstream hypothesis, in the sense that most people, do you believe in UFOs, is assumed to mean, do you believe in extraterrestrials? But if you believe in UFOs, you simply are saying, yes, there are unidentified flying objects. Whether they're extraterrestrial is an interpretation of an observation. But for most people, the UFO and ET are the same thing. So there's that level of the mythology, the ET frame of reference, and then there's also the subtext that was hidden and it's implicit in the original creation myth of this idea that, and but one more piece. He goes home that day. He lands and he's talking to reporters. The phone is ringing off the hook. It changed his life. He's another one the UFO phenomenon didn't do very good for. In the big picture, he didn't get $1 million book contract. He didn't get $1 million movie contract. It kind of haunted him. And one way it did haunt him, if you will, he went home that day, landed his plane, got in his car, went home. That night, again, not not disclosed at the time. His daughter Kim said that night in our home, there were orbs of light
Oh, wow.
in our house. Well, again, this is why I don't think we're not going to get out of here with our worldview intact. The UFO phenomenon, if it's real as the evidence, the paranormal event, how would the UFOs over Mount Rainier make it back to Boise 2? There's like the hitchhiker effect, which you're probably familiar with, the Skinwalker Ranch phenomenon. Something follows people home. The paranormal dimension follows people, not always happily in the case of Skinwalker Ranch. So these are aspects of the Ken Arnold sighting which were not part of the popular understanding. I'm going to be talking about the secondary levels of this myth in my new book, and it actually reinforces my intuition about this all along, that if it is ET, the ET dimension is hidden very well in a larger tapestry of mysteries that go to the very heart of what it means to be alive.
I'm fascinated with the parallels between flying saucers and spirit encounters and even Bigfoot. I mentioned briefly before the show as well, the Ape Canyon Sasquatch attack when miners back in Washington on I think one of the rims of Mount St. Helens in 1924 were attacked by a group of Sasquatches. It doesn't have the importance of the Kenneth Arnold story, but it's certainly one of the most important early Bigfoot belief stories. And Fred Beck, who was one of those miners, he wrote his memoir about the events probably 40 years later. And in that book, he said that he didn't think those things were physical ape men at all. He thought it was something that was essentially psychic phenomenon or supernatural phenomenon. I know Jen, who's a paranormal investigator, she has things follow her home, just like Ken Arnold had things follow him home. So,
well, and any comment, Jen, just jump in, because I'll really, I mean, I'll carry on, and I don't have an agenda here. I will mention, if there's anything you do want to say now, just jump in. But
go ahead.
I will say another case that I'm looking at, and turns out people have thought it's probably a cold case, but my intuition, again. By the way, I've learned I've learned to really trust my gut with this phenomenon. I've immersed myself in it and so forth, but I really just partly it's a factor of aging, living long enough, and sort of having an orientation to life, a spiritual practice, meditation, a contemplative approach, being willing to do the work that's required to have an ecology of mind that isn't crazy. Because this field is, by the way, I think a lot of the craziness in the field, when people don't do well psychologically, it's because they don't have a practice of some kind. They don't have an orientation to that it's all okay. That even the dark side of this phenomenon, you can set limits. You can say no.
Yeah.
No is a complete sentence in human relationships and with relationships to extraterrestrials. I think you can say no, or aliens, or other beings, other worlds. So anyway, I followed my intuition, and I went just about 6 weeks ago, went down to Pascagoula, Mississippi. As you know, the 1973 Pascagoula River abduction, which was only the second major abduction, and after Betty and Barney Hill, which was a two-person abduction. Two fellows, Charlie Hickson and Calvin Parker. I'll just briefly summarize it. They were two good old boys. Calvin was 19, first day at work at the shipyard, gotten a job because Charlie Hickson had gotten him the job there. They weren't the same age. Charlie Hickson was 42. So 42 and 19, they weren't great buddies. But at the end of the day, Charlie says, "Hey, you want to go fishing?" And Calvin said, "I'd love to go fishing." They both are, real down to earth, Pascagoula. They love fishing. And I will probably do their accents because I've spent time down there, and it's a great deal of affection for Calvin Parker. Fantastic. So Charlie said, "Let's go over here." And he drove to a place. He said, "Let's fish off this pier." And Calvin said, "Well, that's a no trespassing. Charlie, you're fixing to get us arrested." He said, "No, it's fine. I fish down here all the time." So they went out on the pier. And interestingly, Calvin Parker, young 19-year-old, looks across at a Coast Guard ship in the water. And he works at a shipyard, right? And he says that he had this hunch. You see, this question, how the hell does a big steel ship float? Well, he hadn't read Archimedes, the great Greek philosopher who talked about the buoyancy principle and the density issues. But he was raising a good issue. How does a big old steel ship stay on top of the water? I never thought of that. It was just a thought in passing. Then next thing, he's got his fishing pole and the line. He sees blue lights out over the water. He said, I told you, Charlie, that's the police and they're fixing to arrest us. And you're going to I'm going to pay my way out of the jail tonight. They turned around and he wished it was the police, because it wasn't the police. It was a craft hovering above the land. A door opened up like out of something from Star Wars. Trust me, these men were not into UFOs, Star Wars. They were living in a small town in Mississippi. Neither of them, I think, graduated high school. Okay, they were not looking for a UFO experience. They both were paralyzed, unable to move, terrified. As Calvin says, three ugly creatures ambled out of this thing floating. What I find very good about the case is it doesn't fit the grays with the big heads. It's a far different anatomy than we've seen. So that, in my sense of things, adds credibility to the case. If all the aliens look alike, you can assume a social contagion theory. Yeah. Well, they were paralyzed. They took hold of each one of them. They both felt an injection, like maybe they had been injected with something to make them calm. They both were taken inside. They both had examinations of some kind. Eventually were put back out on the ground. Looked around. This thing takes off, but doesn't take off. It disappears. It goes up in a straight line and like a TV set going off. Again, far more suggestive of another dimension than necessarily a spacecraft that goes off like a spacecraft. It could be from outer space. We don't know. So long story short, Calvin did not want to contact. Now, here's how it went. Charlie said, well, the worst has happened, so we need to talk about this. And Calvin, 19, said, there is nothing for us to talk about. There's nobody that needs to know anything about this. And Charlie says, we've got to tell somebody this could be an invasion. He says, we've got to tell nobody. What we've got to do is go to work tomorrow morning. I just started a job. He's very practical. He didn't want anybody. Again, so his instinct was he wasn't looking for publicity. So they went to the sheriff's office. They were interviewed separately. At the end of the day, sheriff said, I'm going to try something. I'm going to hide a tape recorder in a desk, put these two boys in that room. He'd already told them, if you're making this stuff up, you guys are in serious trouble. You will do jail time if you're wasting our time with this nonsense. Or in effect, he didn't say nonsense. He hid the tape recorder, put him in there thinking he's going to get a tape recording, something like, well, we really got him going now, don't we, Charlie? Why? And we're going to get a TV show, get a movie. Now you got to stay with the story. No, that's not what they heard. Sheriff came in, got the tape recorder. They didn't know what it was. And by the way, the two witnesses played it back outside of their listening range. These men were terrified. They describing clearly a traumatic, they had had a real experience. Experience of what? We don't know. That is to say, extraterrestrial, from another planet, from another dimension. It materialized with the clarity. I often say, people say, do you think the abductions are real? I'd say, if it happened to you, the same experience, you would think it's real. You would absolutely think it's real. So the police said these men have had a real experience. They went on and lived their lives. So here's an interesting thing. Charlie Hickson is now passed away. Calvin Parker is now about 70 years old. I wanted to go down to see him because what happened, here's an interesting story about, here's an interesting dimension of this, which goes to this whole question of what do you do as a witness? Calvin Parker stayed quiet. He believe it or not, the believe it or not doesn't refer to what I'm about to say, but it relates to it in another way. He was planning to get married to his wife, Wynette, his fiancée, Wynette, just 2 weeks later. They went ahead and got married. But for 45 years, Calvin Parker never told his wife exactly. He'd never told the story. All she knew was what she had read in the papers about what her now husband said. She trusted him. She said, you know, Keith, I always said that when Calvin was ready to tell me, he would tell me. So meanwhile, he lived with his story. The trauma of it was intense because he never really processed it until the following. He and Wynette went to a wake, a funeral, 45 years later, of a neighbor. And Calvin was so intent on not having himself associated with this lifetime experience, he'd started going by another name. He was known as Randy. Well, he went to the funeral registry and made a mistake. He signed his real name. He wasn't thinking. People said, well, you're Calvin Parker. It's Calvin Parker, the UFO guy. And Calvin turned to his Wynette and said, this isn't right. This isn't right. We got to get out of here. This is not respectful to this man. His funeral. So he went out into the car and she said, Keith, I looked at Calvin. And I said, Calvin, you've got to write your book. You've got to live this thing. And the first person you've got to tell is me. I'm ready to know. He said, I'm ready to tell you. So they sat down and he told her the whole story. He ended up writing the book. Now, here's the interesting thing about the case and why I went to Pascagoula, Mississippi, 50 years later, in terms of the case. When he wrote the book, he had disappeared for 45 years. Nobody knew how to find Calvin Parker. So it turned out there were other witnesses the same night who saw the craft, saw something in the same place that they were. There were deputy sheriffs had seen it. They had hundreds of calls that night. It was only when Calvin Parker resurfaced that the other witnesses could resurface as well. So an event of that kind was frozen at every level because the last remaining primary witness had it frozen in his own mind. And until he could come forward and make it public, the other witnesses, why, that's Calvin Parker. He's back. And they went to his book readings. You know, he did a book signing at a local bookstore, one after another. I don't mean to say hundreds, but an old man named Leonard Lee was 85 years old. Calvin, I saw it that night, seen that damn thing, and I always thought I hoped to have a chance to tell you. I'm glad you came out and wrote this book so I could tell you. Well, his story got published and other witnesses. So I don't know, it's to me, I'm a sucker for a happy ending. And so what's the moral of the story? If you have had a UFO experience, people often ask me, whether it's a UFO close encounter of the first kind or second kind at a distance, or what's called an abduction, this really harrowing experience of being taken inside and experimented on and so forth. If you've had that experience, do not tell everybody. Do not tell Oprah. Do not go public, but tell somebody. Do not keep it to yourself. In the same sense that a crime victim should not keep it entirely to herself or himself. You've got to begin, because it is a trauma. The UFO experience is traumatic to the body and mind on many levels. So I'll be writing about Calvin Parker and his story. I think it's just terrific the way it's turned out.
I can't wait to read your new book. It was interesting when you talked about social contagion when it comes to the prevalence of the gray extraterrestrial in modern abduction law now. And I think you've certainly got a very strong case. I always suspect that there must be a social component to it. And it's interesting when we look at things like the abduction we were just talking about, when we look at events like the Villa Boas abduction in was it in Brazil? Was Villa Boas in Brazil? Anyway, that earlier abduction, when we look at other earlier ET reports in UFO law, whether it's the Hopkinsville Goblins or whether it's the Flatwood Monster, there seemed to be this diversity of ET type. And something has happened where today, even if you talk about extraterrestrials or you talk about aliens, there's this very powerful social force which materializes, that, you know, creature with the big gray head with the bulbous teardrop shaped eyes, and that's what we imagine. Do you think somehow And this is a little more esoteric. I don't doubt there's some type of social contagion. I don't doubt some of it is actually, particularly some abduction cases brought out under hypnosis, possibly are false memory syndrome, or possibly them being so led and confabulating such a story with the hypnotist that you can't tell what's real and what's not anymore. But do you think some of it is the phenomenon itself presenting the way we expect to see it? Like it goes, okay, this is what we're going to do. We're going to put on the gray man mask now.
Well, you've really just nailed a lot of big issues. This is Jacques Vallée's theory in a nutshell. He was a skunk at the picnic in the sense that when he came into ufology, he was a believer in the ET hypothesis because it made the most sense. Level 1 ET story. We're being visited, consistent with the data. Everything is there. The UFO phenomenon has something that is consistent with practically every theory. Well, so Vallée started with the ET, but he began to see, the abductions happen in mythology, in different traditions. There are abductions. There are craft. In the Middle Ages, we see flying saucer type orbs in religious painting. So he made that larger connection, and he actually did argue, and still does, that this is an intelligence. Okay, and it's a precognitive intelligence. If you look at what's going on at Skinwalker Ranch, it anticipates the human response. It appears to be involved in shaping the human response, informing our belief systems in some sense. You don't need a paranoid idea about that. But as to the other issue you raised, I think there is much of the abductionology stuff that I'm going to be. First of all, I think there is a core phenomenon that is at the heart of these abductions, that Charlie and Calvin was not a waking dream. All of the prosaic, mundane explanations, a waking dream. I love the psychiatrists come up with that. Tell me about the prevalence of group waking dreams, will you now? The clinical basis for that. Not that there aren't psychological levels, there are. But in any case, I think an discussed factor with the abductions is two researchers, Bud Hopkins and a guy named David Jacobs from University of Temple University historian, were both strongly committed to the literal interpretation of the ET hypothesis, that they were real grays, they were really coming, hard-edged. Bud Hopkins and I had an argument once. I said, don't you ever begin to think that there might be some other dimensions? That if you looked at the parapsychological evidence, literature, he said, we don't need more dimensions. We've got all the dimensions right now that we need. We have all the dimensions we need. I'll never forget he said that. And ironically, there was a kernel of truth. We do have all the dimensions we need, but we have more than four. Our science tells us we have 3 dimensions of space and 1 of time, 4-dimensional reality. I'm convinced that's a subset of a much larger set of dimensions. We just haven't figured out. We don't know how to read them. We have more dimensions of time, more dimensions of space. There can be wormholes. I mean, there's a lot of new connections that can make possible an interdimensional multiverse thinking. But Hopkins and Jacobs wanted none of it. They really were convinced that these aliens were coming and abducting and doing genetic samples. They shaped the responses. In one of Jacobs' books, I was struck, actually stunned. I don't know Jacobs, and I respect him. He was a sincere guy, and he did his best. He really believes that there's an advanced hybrid project going on to change our genetics, and there are hybrids walking among us. I think it's pretty much bad science fiction because there were hybrids in other mythologies. It's a common theme, the gods and the humans coupling. It didn't start in 1947, David. In any case, he talks about in his book, it's almost psychologically revealing in a way that he doesn't understand. He says, I had come to learn, he said, as I got my method of hypnosis down. I could tell when someone was confabulating. And I go, well, how did you know they were confabulating? In other words, how did you know they weren't good cases? Because they came up with creatures that were nothing like what we know. I read that and I go, we come up with creatures. So we take the Pascagoula boys off the table, do we, David? Maybe there's a Star Wars bar level of diversity going on with the other world. You're basically saying you selected out of the pool those cases that don't fit a level 1 gray, bug-eyed, big-headed alien. Do you know what you're revealing, sir? You're not revealing bad motives. You're revealing bad research. So I think there has been a social contagion part. And then John Mack, the great John Mack, we'll talk about, maybe I'll come back another time and do a whole show on John Mack. I have a lot of respect for John Mack. It turns out, I had been studying the UFO phenomenon. I'd given a talk on the parallels between the abduction experience and rites of passage, informed by the great Joseph Campbell, the mythologist who I actually had the opportunity to take classes with.
Oh my goodness.
My resume, small classes with Joseph Campbell. How about that?
Wow.
Workshop setting. And he was a brilliant, wonderful guy. And he would have loved the UFO thing. In any case, Mac had read a talk that I'd given comparing the UFO, the abductions to rites of passage. And he got in touch with me. And he went on to become the controversial Harvard psychiatrist who nearly lost his job and his standing because he dared to raise speculations about the implications of all this. He went down a road for a while taking the abductions literally. By literally, I mean one interpretation. He thought maybe there was a hybrid genetic program going on. He came to see it was far more paradoxical, far more trickster. Like the trickster element here is huge. Trickster not in the common sense of conning, but the trickster archetype. You've got to study, you get involved in UFOs. If you take the class with me, I'm going to actually assign some reading on the trickster myth, because the trickster is a bivalent, plays both sides. He tricks people, he fools people, he misleads people. The trickster archetype was very big for Jung because it upsets the rational assumptions. It opens us to a larger universe. So I think there's a huge component of the UFO that is a trickster dimension. And it's one reason the field goes off onto so many blind alleys. I think the current blind alley is the expectation. It's been said for 75 years, always literally, always with bated breath. Any day now, the lid on the government cover-up is going to blow sky high. We're going through a new round of that. Lou Elizondo and the other researchers, I don't know him, but I admire him. He seems to be a straight shooter. But mainstream ufology is convinced that the full story will be told by what the government knows. I think the expectation of disclosure misses the larger disclosure. And the larger disclosure is closer to revelation. It is mystical, it is transpersonal, it refers to levels of the collective unconscious that I think are bleeding through. I think we are moving into, I think the universe is saying, that's what the name of my next book is called, Cosmos Calling. I'm saying the UFO phenomenon is a call from the cosmos to play a bigger game, to move into more of our own potential on multiple levels, and minimally get over this idea that mind and matter are separate categories, that they can't communicate. We all know synchronicities happen, that mind and matter are already secret symmetry with each other. Mind is not dense. Matter is not dense. And mind and matter are not what we understand them to be. And the UFO phenomenon, I think, is here to sort of pry open precisely with its paradoxes, its riddles, its dead ends. All of that is designed like a Zen koan, in Zen practice, the paradoxical questions, like the Zen master will say to the student, what was your face before? What was your original face? What was your face before you were born? That's not meant to get an accurate answer. It's meant to stop the mind. The koan, what is the sound of one hand clapping? That will stop the mind. I think the UFO is a kind of koan. It has come to slip between our categories and baffle and bedazzle and bewilder us as an opening to a larger sense of living in this cosmos on a more mature and graduated level.
Oh, wow. I normally wind down the show at the hour level because I don't like to keep guests too long, but I'd like to keep chatting. Could you go for maybe another 20 minutes or so, Keith?
Sure. Like they say on talk radio, could I stay for another segment?
Yeah, there you go. Exactly. Talking about this belief in this ever coming but never actually arriving idea of US government disclosure. Do you think that very concept in some ways derails the potentials you're talking about cosmic awakening, or about a call from the cosmos that helps us look beyond? Because if the UFO community doesn't trust the government, which I don't blame them, but secondly, it thinks the answers are going to come from the government, it's a very strange kind of wheel that they've become trapped in. Instead of looking elsewhere, it's like they'll tell us one day. They're about to tell us, you know.
Well, the very government that and by the way, there's evidence that the government is hiding. Mostly, I think. Again, this is a gut response. I don't track. By the way, I don't go deeply down the government document route. I've never asked for a freedom of information. Never filed an FOIA request. I know the documents exist. I know there's a lot of disinformation. There was a government agent named Jim Doty for a long time who finally confessed that his job.
We had Doty on the show, actually.
Okay, and I've never met him. I think I'd enjoy him. He sounds like he's got a kind of a trickster dimension of his own personality.
He may be the trickster of ufology. I think that man is so important in the shaping of UFO belief, which he says he isn't. I think he had so much to do with what people believe today. It isn't even funny. Anyway,
I do too, and I think he saw Linda Moulton Howe coming from a long way and fed her stuff. And I respect her. She's been great on the cattle mutilations. If you can talk about being great on that issue, what a gruesome side corridor of this whole thing that is. But yeah, I think there's a curious way in which the phenomenon, I don't want to get too poetic about it, but it's almost like, yeah, what is it in one book of the Bible? Let us go down there and confuse their speech. And then it's, in other words, let us, the spirits, go down and confuse their speech. Let us, babble.
Yes, in Genesis, right?
Yeah, it's Genesis somewhere. Yeah. Well, the phenomenon loves to do this. When I say the phenomenon loves to do it, the expectation of disclosure is, we don't know what happened at Roswell. So clearly something crashed. Almost certainly did. It was gathered up with great force. I know, I've been around, I know the case can be made for an extraterrestrial craft. I know that case very well. I know best researchers on that argument. I also know very, very informed arguments for that it was a US government craft or possibly another government's craft. They clearly wanted to get it all swept up. They did sweep it up. Funny, nobody kept, well, actually, I'm told somebody has kept some of the wreckage material. Government tried very hard to get it back. These are all motifs, by the way, that just play into the constant thickening of the plot. Likewise, Bob Lazar in Las Vegas, just real briefly. In a court of law, if you can find evidence that on any single issue the witness has been less than truthful, the judge will tell the jury, you have a right to disregard everything they've said. So it's possible, without that strict a standard in that case, it's possible that Bob Lazar did work where he said. He did work for Area 51. He did work for Los Alamos. He says he saw and was involved with back engineering spacecraft. Okay, I know the argument. I know the case. I don't know him. I don't think I'll get to know him. I'm not looking to meet him. But he also says he got a master's degree from MIT. Well, MIT says, we never heard of this guy. Okay, well, the Lazar people say, well, the government took away, they went into the MIT file and they took all the records. MIT said, no, that doesn't happen. It doesn't happen. We've never heard of him. He can't identify a single professor. We don't have a master's dissertation, master's thesis. The point is, I don't know if he invented his credentials about the school, but it thickens the plot. It impugns his integrity on some aspect, and it makes it less. But is it possible that he has some flaws about his education claim, and maybe did see back engineering of spacecraft? I don't know. I think he's an example of a kind of rabbit hole phenomenon. Roswell is a rabbit hole. in that I don't believe we're going to get any, I do not expect any revelation to come about Roswell. I will be truly surprised if there's a definitive disclosure. I do know, by the way, one more thing that's often said, and this is out in the public right now again, there's a whole new round of crash saucer retrievals. There's always rumors, there are people who get quoted as saying, I can't say more, but I'm confident that we do have exotic material. Lou Elizondo has said that he can't say so for sure, but he believes we probably do have exotic material. I love that phrase, exotic material. It implies recovered hardware. And yet, it's what I call ambivalent matter. It is never fully confirmed. By the way, Jacques Vallée has done some research on stuff that has been discovered to have fallen from these apparent craft, and it's weird. It's weird stuff. It's not definitively from here. It's consistent with being from here. This is perfect. The material is consistent with being from here in some respects, but there are isotope percentages that don't make sense. Perfect. Another middle range, stays in the middle, entices us. So I don't expect the disclosure avenue, and there's always talk. By the way, let me sort of contradict myself. We are having UFO hearings again. We just had one in the House of Representatives. So I actually celebrate those. I'm glad that's the case, because I think it will show the limits of what's possible in that thing. But it's also going to bring out some bigwigs, get them to speak to the very interesting, the Nimitz, by the way, the Nimitz videos are remarkable. In the USS Nimitz aircraft carrier are remarkable. The execution of these trajectories, but I'll be surprised if, as you say, I don't expect the government to. I think the government mostly is sitting on not wanting us to know that they don't want us to know. The phenomena seems to disable our missiles. Okay, there are some pretty good evidence of this phenomenon disabling our missile silos and changing the launch information. That's pretty weird. Is that extraterrestrials doing that, or is it a trickster phenomenon? Is it, if it's extra dimensional, if these are other dimensions, it could be that the spiritual levels on this planet are saying we've got to somehow stop these nuclear these nuclear powers, sort of disable their capacity to really damage. I mean, a nuclear event would change a whole lot in this entire universe. So again, I'm not going down that road in terms of arguing for that, but there are many, many different ways to take this stuff.
Yeah, there seems to be a story element there. When you were talking about, for example, things like Roswell being a rabbit hole, and it just kind of fuels this kind of uncertainty. It reminds me of older traditions, not so much that little gray men are like elves of the past or fairies of the past, but that a lot of traditional folklore and fairy tales and the like always kind of ended with us not being able to get our grips on this alternative world. So you go to fairyland and you'd come back with the piece of gold or the something from fairyland in your pocket, and it would turn into dust. Do you know what I mean? As soon as you brought it back to the mortal world. And it seems to me, not just with the UFO phenomenon, but with all of this phenomenon, is that whether it's UFOs or whether it's Sasquatch or whether it's ghosts, there's never quite enough evidence. Like you were saying, the isotope's a little bit off, or there'll be a hair from a Sasquatch, which doesn't really prove anything, but the DNA check says, well, there's something kind of weird there, or there's a photo from a ghost hunt, which you can't quite tell whether it's, it's fake or maybe it's real. There always seems to be this level of uncertainty. And that makes some people who are more skeptical, of course, or debunking, I'm just dismissing it. But I wonder if that isn't part of what this does, part of the whole purpose of the way whatever these things are that interconnect with us, whether they are real and external, or whether it's our own collective unconscious somehow, manifesting. It seems to be like it fulfills this need for mystery, like it's never going to give up never going to give up the evidence, so to speak.
Well, you just hit on a major dynamic. The phenomenon appears in forms too ludicrous to be taken seriously by the upper echelon of the target society. That is to say, science, academia, and the media are the agents of credibility, if you will. At this point, I wouldn't put the media, I wouldn't put any of them as agents of our most credible sources, but they are the agents of authority. They officially, the phenomenon appears in forms too absurd to be taken literally or be taken seriously at all. And so the debunkers move in, not true skeptics. True skeptics say, let's explore this. This is pretty amazing. Seems impossible, but there it is. The debunkers say no. So the debunking, the suppression of the stories doesn't make them go away because the phenomenon continues to appear. There's a split. The authorities say, no, it didn't happen. After the witnesses say something happened, the debunkers say, no, it didn't. And it continues to happen. And so what happens is these stories get, suppressed. They go underground, if you will. And then they become far more symbolically significant. Then they develop a symbolic mythological dimension. The mythological dimension, in a large part, is because of that deadlock in the space of that impasse between what the official culture will allow and what is being experienced among the folk. Like in the German folk, they told fairy stories. Fairy stories were real. They were told by the Grimm brothers, went around and collected these stories. And by the way, the Grimm brothers fairy tales that have been passed down to us are highly sanitized. These are dark, dark stories of the psyche in its multidimensionality. And thank goodness, C.G. Jung and Marie-Louise von Franz, some of the best Jungians, and Joseph Campbell have understood that the fairy tales, the fairy stories, are repositories of deep teachings that are not meant for children, that are not only for children. So in the space between what the official culture doesn't allow and the fact that this phenomenon continues to unfold, in that space, that's where Vallée's thinking, Jacques Vallée's thinking about, is there kind of a conditioning? Is this impasse part of the conditioning? For example, in 1897, as you probably know, there were the Texas airship sightings. And the technology of the air, first of all, it was before the Wright brothers, 7 years before the Wright brothers. So there were airships that precipitated, anticipated what the Wright brothers were just about to do. They're peering in strange gondola-type ships, very credibly reported by sheriffs in Aurora, Texas. It's as if what's shown to the general population is a technology that's a little more advanced than we've got. So just as the airships were just a little more advanced than what the Wright brothers were about to present, the flying saucers, which Kenneth Arnold did not report that they were flying saucers. He said they were stingrays that move like saucers, and they changed their density. In any case, it's as if the phenomenon anticipates what we can believe. It doesn't go too far beyond our belief system, but it's designed to pull us a little further and into imagine even more. And that's what I think part of the call of the cosmos is calling. There's in all the great spiritual traditions, there are calls to worship, calls to prayer. It can be bells, gongs, trumpets, drums. It's time to go to the sacred time. And what call to worship says is that it's time for a different state of consciousness. We're now going into practice. And as one theme I'm going to be developing is that a call is by itself just a monologue. It's a one way. It's the response is the other part of it. So there's a call and response to the UFO phenomenon. The phenomenon is the call, and our response is all of the stuff we've been talking about tonight. Everything from debunkers, who were completely disingenuous characters, bad actors, true skeptics, popularizers like Carl Sagan, who understood that the UFO could be good for him, but he played it pretty safe, and the whole cast of characters that are part of it. it's an incredible phenomenon. And I find that just one more point. I actually find as I've been studying this for all these years, I'm actually coming back to it now with a kind of beginner's mind, because I have, I feel like it's almost with a clean slate, because I have deepened, I've studied so many different aspects of this, and I've been to so many dead ends and what doesn't go into fruition. I've come to sense there's a larger story. And so I don't think this phenomenon is simply objective at the objective level. It has objective dimensions, but it's not simply an objective phenomenon. Neither is it simply subjective. It straddles the fence between objective and subjective. And that, I think, is a big part of its teaching. And so I'm approaching it as, I'm writing this book. I was telling someone the other day, I'm writing this new book, Cosmos Calling, for, actually, I imagine a reader who will come to the book cold, like maybe tracking what the Pentagon has been saying. Gee, there does seem to be an upsurge in these reports. Here's this book by Keith Thompson called Cosmos Calling. He seems like a fair dealer, plain dealer, maybe trustworthy. He doesn't seem to be a nutcase. Get to know me better. You might change your mind on that. But in any case, I want to write this for the reader who might be coming to it cold, who might say, what is going on with the abductions? What's the best open empirical case that can be made? And at the same time, if I write this book for the reader who's coming to the phenomenon cold, I think I'm also writing it for the advanced reader as well. Because I don't think there's any real difference between the reader who's coming to it cold and somebody like me who's been at it 30 years, because I don't have any more answers. I think I'm getting better at asking the right questions and letting it take me. But I have never gone down any of the blind alleys. I have had my beliefs, and I've changed my beliefs. But I think part of why this isn't a good phenomenon for some people is because they're expecting to get it all resolved rationally, only rationally. And I don't think that's going to happen. In fact, I think what it's doing is pointing beyond. It's actually short-circuiting human rationality. It's meant to short-circuit rationality. Not to say that rationality is not, we need a rational approach. So I'm not anti-rationality. But there's a kind of soul dichotomy, thinking it has to be mind or matter, spirit or body, etc. No, this phenomenon says, oh, I'm going to have so much fun with you. Bring me your best dichotomies, because I will subvert all your beliefs. Watch me. That's what I think this thing's about. So because I come into it with that expectation that much of it is trickster, I don't expect a final culmination. The culmination will be an ongoing engagement with this thing. I don't think we're going to get any. We'll get small disclosures. I hope we do. And I hope more comes out. I think the government hasn't been forthcoming. But I don't expect any full disclosure. I think this is, and I'm in the midst of writing a book, so I don't finally know where I'm going to end up, which is also very exciting. I don't have a single hypothesis to press here. I'm going down many different avenues.
Well, I think we're in a time, since probably more so even than since you wrote your last book, that we need a new book from Keith Thompson. I think a lot of, as you said, there's a reinterest in the phenomenon, and there is that automatic way that whether it's the hearings or whether it's so much of ufology, it tends to want to jump onto the physical bandwagon. It seems the more seriously it's taken by authorities, the more we want to say it's physical and they know the answers. So we need to continue to look at this imaginative or this mythical or the idea that maybe the cosmos is sending us some type of message. So I'm so happy and I'm so grateful you're writing another book. So thank you, Keith. And how do our listeners and our viewers actually track what you're up to? Where can they get a hold of you?
Well, okay, good. I have a website, and I'll tell you what it is. It's called Thompson at Large, and the at is spelled A-T, Thompson, Thompson, A-T, large, Thompson at Large. That means my sense of being out in the world. I'm at large with ideas. ThompsonAtLarge.com. I'm not doing a lot of writing there, but my email, I can be reached by email there. So anybody who's heard this and wants to get in touch, the book Angels and Aliens is out of print, so I don't make any money from it. It's available from Amazon at prices that are sometimes cheap and sometimes not. But that's available through used bookstores. And my book, Cosmos Calling, I don't know what the subtitle is yet. I'm pretty sure that's going to be the title. It will be out at the end of next year from Inner Traditions Books. So anyway, in the meantime, follow me places like this. I've enjoyed this conversation. Look for me on the website, send me an email, and look forward to keeping in touch with you guys.
Oh, excellent. Well, there's some big changes we can't announce yet about Talking Weird, but let's get you back on sometime before the next year elapses, because I've had such an enjoyable time talking to you. You were a great joy, sir. So thank you again so much for coming on. And until we get to chat to you again, keep it weird.
All right, I sure will. Thank you, both of you as well.
Thank you.
Keep it weird. Thank you for joining us tonight. If you're interested in checking out more episodes, you can find us at talkingweird.com. If you haven't already, please like the show on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Talking Weird Podcast. Make sure you never miss an episode by subscribing to Talking Weird. We're available on most podcast platforms and YouTube. And if you do enjoy the show, please leave us a review. Dean and I would really appreciate it. Until then, stay safe and keep it weird.